"Give it to me. You don't have the right to keep a single cent," Richard Coleman shouted as he ripped the white envelope from Annie's hand. It happened so suddenly that Annie stumbled half a step backward. Her heel caught on the handle of the mop leaning against the housekeeping cart. The mop tipped sideways and struck the bucket, sending a sheet of murky gray cleaning water spilling across the polished hallway floor. Annie grabbed the cart to keep herself from falling, her shoulder bumping against its padded side hard enough to make the bottles of cleaning solution and stacks of folded towels rattle on the shelves. Richard looked at the spreading water, then at the envelope in his hand. Instead of asking whether Annie was all right, his face tightened with anger. Unbelievable. He pointed at the floor, his voice growing louder. "First you decide you can pocket $200 of a guest's money, and now you dump an entire bucket of dirty water in the middle of the hallway. Do you have any idea this is a 5-star hotel? Or do you think this is some place where you can do whatever you want?" Heat rushed into Annie's cheeks. She bent down and pulled the fallen mop out of the walkway so no one would trip over it, then straightened again. The hand resting on the cart was still trembling slightly. "Mr. Coleman, please don't say that. I didn't take that money from a guest. They left it for me." Richard did not even bother to look at her. He tore open the flap of the envelope with his thumb and pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills. He held them between his fingers, turning them over as though he were inspecting something he had just confiscated. Annie stared at the front of the envelope. The words written in blue ink were still clearly visible beneath Richard's hand. "For Annie, thank you for your dedication." Annie drew a deep breath, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Please give it back to me." "My name is right there on the envelope." Richard's head snapped up. His eyes turned cold. "I don't care whose name is written on it, but the guests left it for me. They checked out less than an hour ago. I took care of their room all week. I brought them extra towels and cleaned the room at the times they requested. They thanked me before they left. So what?" Richard lifted his chin. "Because a guest writes your name on an envelope, you think you can take the money and carry it home? I haven't even left this floor." Annie pointed toward the room behind her. "I just finished cleaning their room. I haven't even had a chance to put the envelope away." Richard shoved the 2 bills back inside with a curt movement. "Then that's even better. At least I caught you before you took it." The accusation left Annie staring at him in disbelief. "You're talking as if I stole it. If you keep cash without turning it in, what I choose to call it doesn't matter. But no one has ever told me that housekeepers aren't allowed to accept tips." Richard glanced down at the dirty water creeping toward his shoes. Irritated, he kicked the plastic bucket aside. It skidded across the stone floor, struck one of the cart's wheels, and spun around, leaving another crooked trail of cloudy water behind it. Annie flinched at the sound, but Richard merely brushed at the leg of his trousers as if the mess had nothing to do with him. "There are rules here." He slowed his words, each one carrying the weight of a warning. "All cash tips are turned over to management. Then the money goes into the employee fund. Nobody gets to decide what they keep, just because a guest writes a few nice words on an envelope." Annie frowned. Some of the fear in her eyes gave way to confusion. "What employee fund?" Richard went silent for a beat. Only a beat. But Annie noticed. He stared directly at her, the irritation on his face suddenly hardening into something colder. "What did you just ask me?" "I asked what employee fund. I've been working here for months, and I've never heard of it. I've never received anything from a shared tip fund either." Richard stepped closer. There was barely enough space between them for Annie to catch the sharp scent of his cologne. He no longer needed to shout. The lower his voice became, the more threatening it sounded. "You work here to clean rooms, Annie. Not to question how I run this hotel. I just want to know where the money goes. You don't need to know. But the guest left that money for me. Now listen to me carefully." Richard leaned toward her. "When management tells you how something is done, you follow instructions. You don't stand here arguing. You don't ask questions. And you certainly don't behave as though you have the authority to decide what happens to this $200. Annie looked down at the envelope in his hand. Her throat went dry. To Richard, $200 might have been such a small amount that he would barely think twice about it. To Annie, it was enough to deal with problems that did not disappear simply because she was too tired to think about them. She had taken every extra shift other employees had turned down. For 3 straight weeks, she had barely had a full day off. Every morning, she arrived before many of the guests were even awake. Every evening, she left the hotel with her legs feeling as heavy as lead. Today alone, she had cleaned 13 rooms, changed dozens of sheets, bent down to lift one trash bag after another, and pushed the overloaded housekeeping cart from hallway to hallway. $200 would not make her rich, but it could make 1 week of her life a little easier to breathe through. She forced her voice to steady. "Mr. Coleman, I'm asking you, please." The guests left that money voluntarily. I didn't ask them for it. I didn't hint at anything. I didn't even know the envelope was there until I was making the bed. If you don't believe me, you can call them. Richard gave a mocking laugh. You think I'm going to call a guest because one housekeeper doesn't want to turn over some cash? I just want you to understand that I didn't take it. Everyone here needs money, Annie. He tapped the edge of the envelope against his palm. You're not the only one with bills. I never said I was. Annie swallowed, her eyes still fixed on the envelope. I'm only saying the money was left for me, and I'm telling you for the last time, that isn't your decision. Footsteps sounded from the far end of the hallway just as the tension between them became almost unbearable. An older couple came around the corner carrying several shopping bags. The woman slowed immediately when she saw the puddle of water, the mop lying crooked against the wall, and Annie standing rigidly in front of Richard. Her eyes quickly moved to the envelope in his hand. Is everything all right? She asked. Richard barely turned his head. Internal hotel matter, ma'am. Please be careful. The floor is wet. The man beside her did not continue walking. He looked at Annie, then at Richard. I just saw you snatch that envelope out of her hand. Richard's expression darkened. Sir, as I said, this is an internal matter. An internal matter? The man frowned. Unless my eyes are failing me, there were $200 in there. You grabbed it out of that young woman's hand and then started yelling at her in the middle of the hallway. The woman looked at Annie, sympathy plain on her face. That poor girl looks so exhausted she can barely stand. If a guest left that money for her and even wrote her name on the envelope, why would you take it? Richard straightened the front of his suit and calmly adjusted one cuff. I appreciate your concern, but please allow us to handle hotel business. The woman did not move. I don't know what your hotel policy says, but I know what I just saw: a grown man taking money out of a young woman's hand. Her husband shook his head. Over $200? A vein rose at Richard's temple, but he did not argue. Instead, he turned his back on them as though they had ceased to exist. That cold indifference unsettled Annie even more. Richard stepped close to her and lowered his voice until it was almost meant for her alone. Listen to me carefully. His eyes never left Annie's face. You need this job, don't you? Annie was silent for several seconds before nodding. Yes. Then don't make this difficult. I'm not trying to make anything difficult. I just want my money back. Stop. Richard raised one finger in front of her. I don't want to hear another word about that envelope. Annie tried again. But my mother is... I didn't ask about your mother. The coldness of the words left Annie motionless. Richard saw the flash of hurt cross her face. But he did not stop. Instead, he slowly slapped the envelope against his palm, almost deliberately reminding her that the money was still in his possession. You clean this up. You finish the rest of your rooms. Then you go home and forget this ever happened. Annie gripped the handle of the cart until her knuckles turned white. After a moment, she looked up. What if I ask human resources about that fund? Richard froze. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It was not a friendly smile. It was the expression of a man watching someone take one step too close to the edge of a cliff. You really want to do that? Annie looked at him but said nothing. You've been getting a lot of extra hours lately. Richard continued, his voice becoming disturbingly calm. 38 hours this week. More than 40 last week. Right? A chill moved down Annie's spine. Richard tilted his head. Schedules change very quickly. Hotels have busy weeks and slow weeks. Sometimes we have to cut labor. Sometimes an employee suddenly discovers she isn't quite as necessary as she thought she was. The older couple standing a few feet away had heard enough to understand. The man spoke up angrily. Are you threatening her? Richard did not even turn around. He kept his eyes on Annie. This is the last piece of advice I'm going to give you. He pointed at the mop. Pick that up, clean this mess, finish your work, and keep your mouth shut about the money. Annie remained still. Richard moved half a step closer. If I hear that you went downstairs to Human Resources and told them I took this envelope, or that you started telling the other employees what happened, you won't need to bother checking next week's schedule." Annie's lips parted, but no sound came out. "Do you understand?" A heavy silence settled over the hallway. Annie looked at the envelope one last time. The words, "Thank you for your dedication," were still visible beneath Richard's fingers. The gratitude had been written for her, but the money was now in the hands of the man using her job to force her into silence. Finally, Annie lowered her eyes. "I understand." Richard exhaled with satisfaction. He knew he had found the right weakness. Not because Annie believed he was right, not because she accepted that the $200 belonged to the hotel, but because he knew that someone who depended on every hour of work to survive would think very carefully before challenging the man who controlled her schedule. Richard straightened his jacket, turned, and headed toward the elevator. He made it exactly 2 steps. A man's hand suddenly grabbed the back of his suit jacket and stopped him cold. Richard was jerked half a step backward. He spun around instantly, anger flashing across his face. "Who the hell do you think you—" The words died on his lips before he could finish. The man standing behind him was about 50 years old, tall, dressed in a simple dark suit that fit him perfectly. One look from him was enough to drain the color from Richard's face. William Whitmore, the owner of the hotel. Richard's face changed almost instantly when he realized who the man holding him back was. The anger that had tightened his jaw vanished in a flash. His shoulders stiffened, and his eyes darted briefly from side to side, as though in the span of a few seconds he were desperately searching for a different way to explain everything that had just happened. "William," Richard said. His voice dropped noticeably, and the arrogance he had shown Annie moments earlier disappeared just as quickly. He tugged lightly at the front of his jacket, trying to recover the composed manner of a general manager simply doing his job. "I didn't know you were coming today." William released Richard's jacket. He did not answer right away. With 2 fingers, he slowly straightened the collar that had been pulled out of place, the gesture so calm that it only made Richard look more uncomfortable. "That's exactly why I didn't announce my visit." Richard swallowed. He glanced at Annie. She was still standing beside the housekeeping cart, one hand resting on the metal handle, the tension still visible on her face. Not far away, the older couple remained near the elevators, clearly in no hurry to leave. Richard immediately saw an opening. "You happened to arrive in the middle of a small misunderstanding." He forced a strained smile. "Nothing serious." William's eyes dropped to the white envelope still in Richard's hand. "If it's only a misunderstanding," he raised his eyes to Richard, "then you shouldn't have any trouble explaining it." Richard's smile faltered. He cleared his throat. "Of course, this employee accepted cash that was left in a guest room. I was simply collecting it according to procedure so the money could be handled properly." Annie immediately lifted her head. "But," Richard raised a hand without even looking at her. "Annie, let me handle this." William looked at the hand Richard had raised between himself and Annie, then slowly shifted his gaze to Richard's face. "No." Richard turned toward him. William continued, his voice still calm but cold enough to leave no room for argument. "You've handled enough." The older man near the elevators gave a quiet sound of approval. His wife folded her arms across her chest, her eyes still fixed on Richard with open disapproval. Richard's cheeks reddened. "William, I assure you, I was only doing my job." "Then let's start with what you're holding." William glanced at the envelope. Richard reluctantly raised it. "A cash tip, $200. I can see the $200. As general manager, I'm responsible for controlling cash found in guest rooms. Employees can't simply see money and decide it belongs to them." Annie could no longer stay silent. "But the guests wrote my name on the envelope." Richard spun toward her. "Annie." William immediately stepped sideways, placing himself squarely in the space between Richard and her. The movement was not aggressive, but its meaning was unmistakable. "She's speaking to me." Richard pressed his lips together. William turned back to Annie. "Go ahead." Annie looked at the envelope. "My name is written right there on the front. The guests even thanked me for taking care of them." William extended his hand toward Richard. "Give it to me." Richard did not move. 1 second passed. Then 2. It was the first time since William had appeared that Richard's hesitation had been so obvious. William kept his hand extended. He did not repeat the request, nor did he need to raise his voice. Finally, Richard placed the envelope in his hand. William turned the front toward himself. The words in blue ink were clearly visible. "For Annie. Thank you for your dedication. He opened the envelope. The $200 bills were still inside. William checked them once, closed the envelope, and turned to Annie. Is this exactly the envelope you found in the room? Yes, sir. When you found it, had the guests already checked out? Yes. They left the hotel less than an hour ago. Did you ever ask them for money? No. Did you hint that you wanted a tip? No, sir. Did you enter the room before they checked out? No, sir. I only went in after the room was marked vacant for cleaning. Richard immediately interrupted. None of that changes the procedure. William slowly turned his head toward him. What procedure? Richard hesitated slightly. The employee gratuity policy. Explain it to me. Richard straightened both sides of his jacket. The question seemed to give him something to hold on to. Some of his old confidence began to return now that he could hide behind language that sounded official. Cash left by guests in rooms must be turned over to management. Management records the amount, transfers it into the employee fund, and then distributes it through approved channels. The procedure prevents disputes in case a guest later claims the money was accidentally left behind rather than intended as a tip. William did not react immediately. He simply looked at Richard. What approved channels? Richard answered quickly. Payroll adjustments, employee recognition awards, periodic distributions throughout the year. So where would this $200 go? Richard slowed down. That would be determined later. By whom? Management. Specifically who? Richard ran his tongue across his lips. Myself and the appropriate department. Which department? Richard hesitated. It depends on the circumstances. William gave a small nod. Not because he agreed. The gesture looked more like he had just added another one of Richard's answers to a list. Richard did not yet realize was growing longer. The older woman near the elevator suddenly shook her head. If that's how it works, it doesn't sound much like a tip anymore. Richard turned toward her, irritation briefly returning to his face. Ma'am, the matter is being handled. I can see that very clearly. Her husband stepped half a pace forward. My wife and I have traveled for years. If I leave $200 in an envelope, write an employee's name on it, and include a thank you note, I don't expect that money to disappear into some fund the person receiving the tip has never even heard of. Richard struggled to keep the smile on his face. Every hotel has its own procedures, sir. Your procedures don't change the intention of the person who gave the money. Richard said nothing. William looked at the couple. Thank you for staying. I'm sorry you had to witness this. The woman looked at Annie, her voice softening. Are you all right, sweetheart? Annie nodded automatically. Yes, ma'am. But her exhausted face, reddened eyes, and the fingers still gripping the handle of the housekeeping cart made the answer unconvincing. The elevator doors opened. The couple stepped inside. The man already had one foot across the threshold when he stopped and turned to look at Richard one last time. Sometimes $200 is enough to tell you exactly what kind of man someone is, especially when he thinks no one important is watching. The elevator doors closed. Richard stared at the metal doors until they were completely shut. His jaw tightened. William turned back to Annie. You were about to say something before he interrupted you. Annie opened her mouth, but before a word could leave her throat, her eyes instinctively drifted toward Richard. It was only a quick glance, but William caught it. He looked at Richard for a second, then turned back to Annie. Don't look at him to figure out what you're allowed to say. Annie froze. William lowered his voice. Not in the gentle tone one might use to comfort a child, but in the voice of someone trying to make her understand that her answer would not be used against her in that moment. Look at me and tell me what you know. If you believe Annie deserved to be heard and treated with dignity, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. And if you enjoy emotional stories about courage, justice, and kindness, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. Annie swallowed and gave a small nod. William asked, when you were hired, did anyone explain this so-called employee fund to you? No, sir. Was it mentioned in your hiring paperwork? No, sir. During orientation? I don't remember anyone saying anything about it. Have you ever received tips before? Annie fell silent. A few feet away, Richard unconsciously shifted his weight. William turned toward him at once. Richard. He looked up, moved 3 steps away from her. Richard frowned. William. That really isn't necessary. 3 steps. Nothing more. Richard stared at William for several seconds, then finally stepped backward. 1 step. Tfo. 3. Stay there. William turned back to Annie. Now you don't have to look at his face before you answer. Annie drew a breath. Guests have left me small tips before. $5. Sometimes 10. Once. 20. I kept them. No one ever told me I had to turn them in. Richard immediately spoke from behind them. Small amounts are handled differently. William turned around. You didn't say that a minute ago. I'm explaining it in more detail now. No. A minute ago, you said all cash tips had to be turned in. Richard's expression hardened. I simplified it so she would understand. She understands perfectly well. William raised the envelope between them. I'm the one who doesn't understand. $5 stays with the employee. $10 does too. What about 20? Richard hesitated. Usually, that wouldn't be an issue either. Then at what amount does it become an issue? There's a certain threshold. What threshold? Richard blinked. It depends. Depends on what? The circumstances. William studied him. You just told me this is a policy. It is. A policy involving cash. Yes. A policy that applies to hundreds of employees. Richard did not answer. William stepped closer. And yet you can't give me a number? Richard lifted his chin slightly. I'd have to check the employee handbook. William nodded. Good. He raised the envelope slightly. We'll check. Richard was no longer answering as quickly as before. Beside them, Annie looked down at the water still spreading across the floor. A guest could come out of the elevator at any moment. She bent down to pick up the mop. William held out a hand to stop her. Wait, but I need to clean this up. Annie looked at the wet floor. If someone steps out of the elevator, they could slip. William watched her silently for a moment. A manager had just ripped her tip away, accused her as though she had stolen something, and threatened to cut her hours. Yet even while her own job was being used as leverage against her, Annie was still worried that a stranger might slip on the floor. William walked over to the service phone mounted on the wall. He picked up the receiver. Housekeeping? Bring a wet floor sign and cleanup supplies to the 14th floor immediately. East hallway. Annie spoke quietly. I can do it myself. William replaced the receiver. I know. He looked at her. But right now, I need you here. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. William. There's no reason to turn a small issue into an investigation. William turned around. A small issue? Richard immediately realized he had chosen the wrong words. William pointed toward the envelope. $200 may be small to you. Then he looked at Annie. But using someone's work schedule to silence an employee is not. Richard immediately protested. I never threatened her. Annie's head snapped up. William stepped toward Richard. I heard you. The 3 words were spoken quietly. Richard fell silent. I heard you say employees who make themselves difficult can lose their hours. I heard you tell her that if she talked to human resources or her coworkers about the envelope, she shouldn't expect to see her name on next week's schedule. Richard drew a breath. You're taking my words out of context. William looked at him without blinking. I was standing less than 30 feet away. Richard tried to speak. William did not give him the chance. I heard everything from the moment you took that envelope until the moment you turned away. So tell me what possible context turns. If you talk about this, don't expect to be on next week's schedule into harmless advice. Richard could not answer immediately. He turned his head aside, collected himself, then said, I've run this hotel for years. You know my results. Occupancy is up. Guest satisfaction scores are up. Labor costs stay below target. I keep this property profitable. I'm running this hotel exactly the way the company expects me to. William stopped looking at Richard. His eyes moved over Annie's housekeeping cart. A stack of towels was still leaning from the impact earlier. A bottle of cleaning solution lay at an angle on one shelf. Her worn work gloves were tucked into a fabric pocket on the side. Beside the cart, the mop lay in the middle of the puddle Annie kept glancing toward because she was worried someone might fall. William looked back at Richard. Then perhaps my mistake was allowing you to believe those numbers mattered more than the way you treat the people who produce them. Richard stiffened. William walked over to Annie and held the envelope out to her. Keep it. Annie looked at him, then at the envelope, as though she still wasn't sure whether she was allowed to reach for it. Sir, take it. She slowly accepted it. Her fingers closed around the envelope, but she held it against her chest as though someone might still take it away at any moment. Richard reacted immediately. William, You shouldn't give that to her until the policy has been verified. William turned his head very slowly. You're right about one thing. Richard straightened slightly. William reached into his jacket and took out his phone. The policy needs to be verified. The screen lit up in his hand, and we're going to verify it right now. The tension on Richard's face became unmistakable. Who are you calling? William searched through his contacts. Corporate headquarters. Richard fell silent. William looked up at him. Until I get an answer, you are not to touch another dollar a guest leaves for any employee in this hotel. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since William had appeared, he stopped trying to force another explanation into the conversation. Annie stood beside the housekeeping cart, holding the envelope against her uniform with both hands. She still did not feel relieved. Everything had happened too quickly. Only minutes earlier, she had been warned that speaking up could leave her with no hours at all the following week. Now the man who owned the entire hotel was standing in front of her, preparing to verify the story Richard had used to frighten her into silence. William pressed the call button. After several rings, someone answered. This is William Whitmore. He never took his eyes off Richard. I need the current gratuity policy for the Atlanta hotel. Not a summary. Not a manager's interpretation. I want the policy that is currently in effect, and I want to know exactly whether employees are required to turn cash tips over to management. Richard lowered his eyes to the floor. William continued. And check whether this hotel has an employee fund designated to receive gratuities. This time, Richard's eyelid twitched. The voice on the other end answered almost at once. Of course, William. Give me a minute to pull up the Atlanta Property Handbook. William kept the phone on speaker. He did not move away from Annie or Richard, and that detail made Richard's discomfort harder to hide. Until now, he had controlled every conversation on that floor. Employees waited for him to finish speaking, supervisors adjusted their answers around his mood, and people learned quickly when silence was easier. Now someone else was deciding how the next few minutes would unfold. Richard loosened his tie. William, before corporate starts digging through policies, I can explain how we handle these situations locally. You've explained it 3 different ways already. I've been trying to give you the full picture. Then the written policy should help. Annie stood beside the cart with the envelope held against her uniform. A housekeeping attendant arrived with a yellow caution sign and fresh mop water. She glanced between the 3 of them, sensed that something unusual was happening, and quietly began cleaning the spill. Annie instinctively reached for the mop. I can finish that, she said. The attendant shook her head. I've got it. Annie thanked her and stayed where she was. The corporate employee returned to the line. I have the policy open. What exactly are you looking for? William asked. Is there any company rule requiring housekeeping employees at the Atlanta hotel to turn over cash tips left directly for them? Keyboard clicks came through the speaker. No. If the gratuity is clearly designated for an individual employee, that employee may accept it. Richard immediately raised a finger. That's the general corporate rule. Atlanta has a property-level procedure. William did not look away from the phone. Check for any approved local exception. Another pause followed. I'm checking now. Richard shifted his weight. There are operational practices that don't always appear in the main handbook. William replied. Then there should be a written approval somewhere. Annie watched Richard's expression change by degrees. The confidence was still there, but it now looked maintained rather than natural. The corporate employee spoke again. I'm not finding any approved tip pool or employee gratuity fund for Atlanta housekeeping. There is a voluntary holiday collection organized by staff each December, but management is not authorized to collect individual guest tips for it. William's eyes went to Richard. Voluntary holiday collection? Richard responded quickly. That may be what I was referring to. You told Annie her cash had to be surrendered. I was trying to keep the process consistent. With a voluntary collection that hasn't started yet? Richard's lips pressed together. William continued with the call. Is there any threshold where a direct tip above a certain dollar amount must be taken by management? No, not under the current policy. $20? No. $200? No. $500? If the guest clearly designates it as a gratuity for the employee, the amount alone doesn't convert it into hotel funds. Larger sums can be documented if there's concern about a mistake, but the employee is not required to surrender the money to a manager's personal custody. William thanked her and ended the call. Richard moved first. There, documentation. That's what I meant. William slipped his phone into his coat pocket. No, Richard, that isn't what you said. I was securing the cash until it could be documented. You put it in your jacket. Temporarily. You told Annie it was going into an employee fund. Richard opened his hands. Poor wording. You said she couldn't keep a single cent. I was frustrated. You threatened her schedule. I was trying to enforce discipline. Annie's grip tightened around the envelope. Each answer sounded smaller than the one before it, as though Richard were removing pieces of his original story and hoping nobody noticed how little remained. William turned to Annie. How long have you been working overtime? She hesitated before answering. Almost 3 weeks. How many days this week? Today makes 6. Richard interjected. She volunteered for extra hours. Annie looked at him. You asked me to stay late 4 times. That doesn't mean you were forced. I didn't say I was. William raised a hand, cutting off another exchange before Richard could reshape it. Annie, why did you take the extra shifts? She looked down at the envelope. Because I need the hours. For yourself? My mother's been sick. She can't work her normal schedule right now, so I've been helping more at home. Richard let out a small sound of impatience. This is becoming personal. Every employee here has expenses. William turned toward him. Exactly. Which is why you don't use their paycheck as leverage. Richard's jaw flexed. Annie continued. I wasn't expecting $200. I didn't ask those guests for anything. They were here several days, and I just tried to make sure they had what they needed. What did you think when you saw the money? William asked. She gave a short, embarrassed laugh that carried no humor. I thought I could pick up my mother's prescription tonight and still pay the electric bill Friday. That answer changed William's expression. Annie seemed to realize she had revealed more than she intended. I'm sorry. I know that isn't the hotel's responsibility. You don't have to apologize for answering my question. Richard folded his arms. And none of this proves I intended to keep the money. William looked at him. Then let's test that statement too. Richard's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means I want your office opened. For what purpose? Because if this is a legitimate practice, there should be records. Receipts. Distribution logs. Something showing where the money goes. Richard immediately objected. My office contains confidential material. So does every general manager's office. Sarah Mitchell can be present, and HR can review only what relates to gratuities. You're treating me like I stole it. William's answer came without hesitation. I watched you take cash from an employee after she told you it had been left for her. Then I watched you threaten her job when she asked for it back. What you call that next depends on what we find. Richard said nothing. Annie lowered the envelope slightly. For the first time since he had taken it from her, she was no longer wondering whether she had misunderstood a rule. The rule had never existed. William called the assistant general manager and asked her to meet them upstairs. Richard's face tightened. You really want to turn this into an investigation over $200? William looked at the man whose salary, benefits, and annual bonus dwarfed what Annie earned cleaning rooms. No, he said. I want to know why someone paid to protect this hotel thought $200 was worth threatening an exhausted employee over. The elevator indicator lit at the end of the hallway. Someone was coming up. Richard glanced toward the doors, then back at William. For the first time, his explanations were finished. Now there would be records. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah Mitchell stepped onto the floor with a tablet tucked under one arm. As assistant general manager, she usually carried herself with the efficiency of someone who could move from a guest complaint to a staffing issue without losing track of either. The moment she saw William standing beside Annie and Richard, however, she slowed. You asked to see me? William nodded toward Richard. We need access to his office. I want every record connected to cash gratuities, employee collections, and any fund he says is used for staff tips. Sarah's eyes moved to Richard. Employee fund? Richard answered before William could. It's an internal practice. I've already explained that. Sarah frowned. I've worked here 4 years. I don't know of any housekeeping tip fund. Richard's face tightened. You don't oversee every operational detail. I oversee the property when you're off-site. That doesn't make you responsible for everything I handle. William raised one hand. We're done debating whether the fund exists. Corporate already confirmed there is no approved program. Now we're checking whether Richard created some legitimate local system and failed to document it properly. or whether there was never a system at all. Annie remained beside the cart, the envelope still in her hand. She wanted to return to work, not because the matter felt settled, but because standing in the hallway while executives discussed her $200 made her feel exposed. William noticed her shifting toward the cart. "Annie, you can come with us if you're comfortable." Richard immediately objected. "Why would she need to be in my office?" "Because you took her money. That doesn't give her access to management files. She isn't reviewing files. She's witnessing what happens to a claim involving her." Annie hesitated. "I can wait out here." William did not pressure her. "That's fine. Sarah, stay with me." "Annie, don't leave the property until HR speaks with you." "But you're still on paid time." Richard gave a short laugh. "This is excessive." William looked at him. "You keep saying that as if repeating it will make your choices smaller." They took the service elevator down 2 floors to the administrative level. Annie followed at a distance after a housekeeping supervisor agreed to take over her remaining rooms. Inside the elevator, nobody spoke. Richard kept adjusting one cuff, then the other, though both were already straight. His office sat behind the front administrative corridor, separated from the public lobby by 2 secured doors. Sarah used her badge to enter the first. Richard opened the second with his key. William stopped him before he reached the desk. "Don't touch anything until Sarah is inside." Richard gave him a hard look. "You really think I'm going to destroy records in front of you? I think you've changed your explanation several times in less than half an hour. I'm not relying on assumptions anymore." Sarah entered and opened the administrative filing cabinet. "What exactly are we looking for? Anything labeled gratuities, tip fund, employee fund, staff collection, or cash distribution?" Richard moved toward a shelf. "If I have something, it would probably be in operational notes." William's eyes followed his hand. "Sarah will check." Richard stopped. Sarah searched the cabinet first. Payroll summaries, vendor invoices, training schedules, department budgets. Nothing related to employee tips. She moved to the desk drawers. "There's no fund ledger here." Richard folded his arms. "Because it isn't a formal fund." William's expression changed. 10 minutes ago, it was formal enough for Annie to lose every dollar. Richard looked toward the door. Annie stood just outside, uncertain whether she should enter. William gestured toward a chair near the doorway. "You can sit there." "I'm okay. You've been working all morning." "I'd rather stand." He accepted the answer. Sarah opened another drawer and found a small accordion file. She pulled it out and set it on the desk. Richard stepped forward. "That's personal." Sarah paused. William asked, "Personal as in your own documents?" "Yes." "Then don't open it." Sarah pushed the file aside. For a moment, Richard seemed relieved. Then she noticed a black notebook underneath it. "This has hotel inventory codes on the cover." Richard's relief vanished. Sarah opened the notebook. Most pages contained routine maintenance, notes, and supply counts. Several pages near the back contained dates, room numbers, employee initials, and dollar amounts. Sarah stopped turning pages. William moved closer. "Read one." She looked at the first line. "November 3rd, room 1218, $40. Another line. "November 6th, room 904, $25. Another. "November 8th, room 1531, $75. Richard stepped toward the desk. "Those are cash incidents. We track them for security." Sarah examined the columns. "Then why is there no incident report number?" Richard said nothing. William pointed to another entry. "What are those initials?" Sarah looked closer. "A. C." Annie's head lifted. William turned toward her. "Annie Carter?" She walked closer but did not cross fully into the office. "I cleaned room 1531 last week." Sarah checked the date. "November 8th? Annie thought for a moment. "Yes." "Did you receive a $75 tip?" Annie shook her head. "No." Richard answered quickly. "That doesn't mean the money was hers. It could have been unclaimed cash." Annie's eyebrows drew together. "A guest told me they left something for housekeeping that day. I never found anything." William looked at Richard. Richard's voice sharpened. "This proves nothing." Sarah turned another page. The initials changed, but the pattern continued. Room numbers. Dates. Cash amounts. No signatures showing distribution. No employee acknowledgements. No accounting references. William asked, "Where did these amounts go?" Richard spread his hands. I'd have to reconstruct each case. You recorded every dollar but not where it went? These were preliminary notes. Sarah checked the final page. Some entries are 6 months old. William's attention shifted to Annie. Has Richard ever taken cash from you before today? She paused longer this time. A few months ago, there was $20 on a nightstand. He said the guest might come back for it. Did you ever get it? No. Richard shook his head. We handle hundreds of lost property situations. She can't expect me to remember everyone. William picked up the black notebook, careful not to disturb anything else. This isn't hundreds of situations, it's a list. Richard's voice rose. You're making assumptions from personal notes. William looked at Sarah. Photograph every page. Send copies to corporate HR and finance. Nobody removes the original. Sarah began documenting the notebook. Richard turned toward William. You're going to damage this hotel over a bookkeeping misunderstanding. William pointed toward Annie without taking his eyes off Richard. She worked extra hours for weeks. A guest wrote her name on an envelope, and you took $200 from her hand while threatening her schedule. Corporate says your policy doesn't exist, and now we've found months of cash entries that never reached accounting. Richard's mouth opened, but William continued. This stopped being a misunderstanding several explanations ago. Annie looked at the notebook again. Her own initials were only one entry among many. The realization settled slowly. Her $200 might not have been the first envelope Richard had intercepted, and she might not have been the first employee who was too afraid to ask where the money went. Sarah finished photographing the last page of the notebook and placed it back on the desk without closing it. The black cover seemed ordinary, the sort of thing a manager might use for supply counts or maintenance reminders, yet the columns inside had changed the direction of the entire afternoon. William looked at Annie. Do any of those initials mean anything to you? She stepped closer and scanned the page Sarah had left open. A, C, appeared twice. Below it were M, T, L, J, and D, W. Annie pointed to one of them. MT could be Monica Taylor. She works housekeeping on 12. Sarah checked another page. Her initials appear 4 times. Richard moved toward the desk. You're turning shorthand into accusations. Those initials could refer to anything. William blocked his path with one arm. Then tell us what they refer to. Richard stopped. Cash found in rooms. Collected from whom? From employees when there was uncertainty. And after the uncertainty was resolved, Richard's eyes moved toward Sarah. Some of it was returned. Show me. I'd need time. You've had 6 months to keep records. Richard's voice sharpened. You're expecting perfect documentation for informal situations. William tapped one finger beside the notebook. You were very formal when you threatened Annie over $200. Annie lowered her eyes for a second. The sentence brought the hallway back into her mind. Richard's hand, the envelope disappearing, the bucket sliding across the floor. Yet the notebook now made the scene feel larger. She had spent the last hour thinking she had been singled out because she was young and easy to pressure. The pages suggested Richard had used the same advantage more than once. Sarah opened her tablet. I can pull staffing records and match these initials. Richard turned toward her. You are not conducting some amateur investigation from my office. Sarah looked up. William asked me to verify company records. I'm still the general manager. William answered before Sarah could. For the moment, yes. So use that moment wisely. Richard's face tightened. Sarah searched the housekeeping roster. Monica Taylor, Darlene Washington, Lisa, Jackson. She paused. All 3 are current housekeeping employees. Annie recognized every name. Darlene works evenings, she said. Lisa usually does the suites. Sarah looked at the notebook again. Their initials show up next to cash amounts. Richard rubbed his forehead. That still doesn't prove they were tips. Annie finally spoke with more force. Then why are my initials there? Richard faced her. Because you were connected to the room. That $75 never came to me. You don't know what the guest intended. I know what they told me. Richard gave a short, dismissive laugh. Guests say things all the time. William's expression shifted. Careful. Richard looked at him. William continued. You've spent the last half hour telling us these were security procedures. Now you're dismissing the people whose money you were supposedly protecting. Richard crossed his arms. I'm saying there's context. Then produce it. Again, nothing came. Sarah's tablet chimed. She had received the corporate employee handbook and the Atlanta property addendum. She scrolled through several pages, then turned the screen toward William. There's a section on gratuities. William read it, then handed the tablet to Richard. Read the highlighted sentence. Richard didn't take it. Richard. He accepted the tablet. His eyes moved across the text. William waited. Richard finally said, cash gratuities clearly intended for an individual employee may be accepted directly by that employee. Annie's fingers curled against the side of her uniform. William asked, keep going. Richard's jaw tightened. Management may document unusually large amounts when necessary to confirm guest intent. And management should not retain designated gratuities after verification. William took the tablet back. There's your policy, Richard answered immediately. That supports what I've been saying. Verification. No, it destroys what you've been saying. You told Annie the money had to go into an employee fund. That sentence doesn't exist anywhere in the policy. I misspoke. You threatened her over a policy you invented. I was trying to keep control of the situation. William looked at him for a long second. That sentence may be the most honest thing you've said today. Richard's posture stiffened. Sarah continued checking the notebook against the employee list. There are 11 sets of initials here that match housekeeping staff. Annie looked at her. 11? Possibly. I'd need HR to confirm all of them. Richard shook his head. This has gone far enough. He reached for the notebook. William caught his wrist before his fingers touched it. Don't. Richard pulled his hand free. You're treating me like I'm dangerous. I'm treating the records like evidence until we know what they show. That notebook is mine. It contains hotel room numbers, employee initials, and cash amounts recorded during work hours. Corporate will determine how it's handled. Sarah placed the notebook into a clear document pouch she found in the administrative supply cabinet, sealed it, and wrote the date and time across the label. Richard watched every movement. Annie noticed something then. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Richard was no longer trying to convince them the fund existed. He was trying to measure how much they could prove. William noticed it too. He turned to Sarah. Call Karen Brooks in corporate HR. Tell her I want a formal review started today. Payroll. Employee complaints. Cash handling. Everything connected to these entries. Richard stepped forward. William, think about what you're doing. If you open a full review, people will talk. Rumors spread. Guests hear things. William faced him. You're worried about the hotel's reputation? I'm worried about protecting the business. No, you're worried about what the business may discover. Richard's expression hardened. I've given years to this property, and that gave you more responsibility, not less. Annie remained near the doorway. She had spent the morning afraid that speaking one sentence could cost her work. Now senior management was moving through records because she had finally answered a question honestly. Sarah stepped into the corridor to make the HR call. William turned to Annie. You said you've seen small tips before. Has anyone else ever talked about money disappearing? Annie hesitated. This time, however, she did not look toward Richard. People talk in the break room sometimes, she said. Mostly they stop when a supervisor comes in. What do they say? That cash goes missing, that someone finds an envelope, then management says it has to be checked. Richard cut in. Break room gossip is not evidence. Annie looked directly at him. No, she said, but that notebook might be. Richard's face changed. William said nothing for a moment. Annie had not raised her voice, yet something in the balance between them had shifted. Sarah returned. Karen is joining by video in 10 minutes. She wants Richard's access to payroll and employee records temporarily restricted while the review starts. Richard turned toward William. You authorized that? I did. You're removing my access before I've even been accused of anything formally? William looked at the sealed notebook. You were formally questioned the moment I saw you take that envelope. Sarah's tablet chimed again. Corporate HR was calling. William picked it up and headed toward the conference office across the hall. Annie, come with us if you're willing. Richard, you're coming too. Richard remained beside his desk for half a second longer than everyone else. Then he followed. The question was no longer whether $200 would be returned. It was how many other employees had been told to stay quiet before Annie finally had someone standing close enough to hear. Karen Brooks appeared on Sarah's tablet from the corporate office, wearing reading glasses and holding a legal pad beside her keyboard. She did not waste time on greetings once she saw William, Annie, Richard, and Sarah gathered around the conference table. William gave me the basic outline, Karen said. Before anyone says anything else, I want this handled carefully. Richard, your access to payroll, personnel files, scheduling changes, and employee complaints has been suspended until we finish the first review. Richard's eyebrows lifted. Karen, you're restricting a general manager because of a notebook and one disputed tip. Because William witnessed you take cash from an employee, corporate found no policy supporting the explanation you gave, and Sarah found records containing employee initials and cash amounts that do not appear in accounting. You're assuming those entries mean something they don't. Then this is your opportunity to explain them. Richard pulled out a chair but did not sit. I already have. Sometimes employees find money in rooms. Management documents it until we know whether it was a gratuity or lost property. Karen glanced down at her notes. Where are the corresponding lost property reports? Richard's answer took a moment. Not every situation generated one. Where are the receipts showing the cash was returned? I would have to check. Where are the records showing any of it entered a staff fund? Richard's mouth tightened. Again, fund may have been the wrong word. William stood near the end of the table with his arms at his sides. It was the right word when you needed Annie to stop asking questions. Richard turned toward him. You've already decided what happened. I decided what I saw. The rest is why we're here. Karen shifted her attention to Annie. Annie, I know you've already repeated some of this. I need your account in your own words. From the moment you found the envelope, Annie sat close to the edge of her chair. She still held the envelope against her lap. The guests had checked out. I cleaned the suite. I found this on the desk with my name written on it. There were $200 inside. I finished the room and pushed my cart into the hallway. Richard saw the envelope and asked what it was. What did you tell him? That the guests left it for me. And then? He told me to give it to him. Richard interrupted. I told her cash had to be verified. Karen held up one finger. You'll have your turn, Annie continued. I said my name was written on the envelope. He took it from my hand anyway. Karen's expression sharpened. Did he ask permission to inspect it? No. Did he give you a receipt? No. Did he tell you when you would get the money back? No. What did he say? Annie hesitated, and William could see the discomfort return. Karen noticed too. You can take your time. Annie nodded. He said it went into an employee fund. When I asked what fund, he told me I needed to follow management instructions. And about your schedule? Annie's fingers pressed into the edge of the envelope. He said if I talked about it, I shouldn't expect my name on next week's schedule. Richard pushed his chair away from the table. That is not how the conversation happened. William looked at him. I heard it. You heard part of an employee management discussion. I heard enough to know exactly what you were using against her. Karen turned back to Richard. Did you tell Annie her hours could be affected if she reported the cash issue? I told her employees who refuse management direction can face consequences. That is not what I asked. Richard rubbed one hand along his jaw. I may have referenced scheduling. Karen wrote something down. So the answer is yes. No, the answer is that you're stripping context away from normal discipline. Annie looked toward Karen. Can I ask something? Of course. If this is a real review, can Richard change my shifts while it's happening? No, Karen said. He cannot change your schedule, reduce your hours, issue discipline, or contact you privately about this matter. Effective now. A small part of the tension left Annie's shoulders. Richard noticed. This is absurd, he said. You're letting an entry-level employee dictate how management operates. William's head turned. She didn't dictate anything. She answered questions. Richard gave him an incredulous look. You've known me for years, and I met Annie today. That doesn't make her answer worth less. Karen nodded toward Sarah. I want the notebook scanned and transferred to corporate. Keep the original secured on property. Next, pull the names matching every set of initials and contact each employee separately. No group interviews. Sarah began taking notes. Today? Starting today, Richard scoffed. You're going to pull housekeeping staff off the floor during peak occupancy? Karen answered without raising her voice. We're going to schedule paid interview time without disrupting operations. That affects labor. William looked at him. You keep returning to numbers. Because numbers keep this hotel open, and people keep it running. Richard looked away. Karen continued. Sarah, I also want every employee complaint filed against hotel management during the last 12 months. Especially anything involving cash handling, retaliation, scheduling, or housekeeping. Richard's head snapped back toward the tablet. There haven't been complaints about me. Karen typed something. Then the records will confirm that. William caught the speed of Richard's reaction. So there are complaints. No, that wasn't a question you needed to answer that fast. Richard's eyes hardened. I know what happens at my hotel. Sarah looked up from her tablet. Actually, there was one housekeeping complaint in July. Richard turned toward her. That was resolved. By whom? Department management. Karen asked. Who was named in the complaint? Sarah scrolled. Her expression changed. Richard. Nobody spoke for a beat. Karen removed her glasses. You were named in the complaint? And management closed it? Richard answered quickly. It was baseless. An employee was upset about her schedule. Who reviewed it? I did, along with the department supervisor. William's face tightened. You reviewed a complaint about yourself? It was an operational dispute, not an ethics investigation. Karen looked directly into the camera. Send me that file now. Sarah forwarded it. Within seconds, Karen opened the document on her screen. She read several lines without comment, then stopped. What? William asked. Karen looked up. The employee wrote that cash tips were being taken from housekeeping staff and that people were afraid to complain because their hours could be reduced. Annie's hand froze around the envelope. Richard stepped toward the tablet. That complaint was never substantiated. Karen's eyes stayed on him. Was the employee interviewed? Richard did not answer. Was anyone else interviewed? Silence from Richard. Karen's voice became firmer. Was the cash allegation investigated at all? Richard finally said, We handled it internally. William looked at the sealed notebook on the side table, then at Annie. The pattern had appeared before. Someone had already tried to warn the hotel, and Richard had been allowed to decide whether the warning mattered. Karen read the complaint a second time, slower now, while Sarah pulled up the attached notes. The original report had been filed 4 months earlier by Monica Taylor, a housekeeping attendant whose initials appeared repeatedly in Richard's notebook. Her complaint was brief but specific. Cash left in rooms had been collected by management. Employees had received no receipts. And anyone who questioned the practice risked losing preferred shifts or extra hours. Karen looked toward Richard through the tablet screen. There's an entry here saying the complaint was resolved after a management review. I want to know what that review involved. Richard shifted beside the conference table. Monica had attendance issues. She was unhappy with scheduling and started making accusations. That doesn't answer the question. I spoke with her supervisor. Did you speak with Monica? Richard hesitated. Not formally. Did HR? No. Did anyone compare her complaint with cash records? There were no reliable cash records to compare. William glanced toward the sealed notebook. Apparently there were. Richard looked at him. Personal notes aren't financial records. They become relevant when they match the exact complaint you closed. Sarah was already searching the employee directory. Monica is working today. She's on 12 until 4. Richard reacted immediately. You cannot pull her into this without preparation. Karen answered. We don't need your preparation. I'm responsible for staffing, not for this interview. William turned to Annie. Do you know Monica well? A little. We've worked the same floor a few times. Has she ever spoken to you about Richard? Annie paused. Not directly. Sarah asked. Anything about tips? Annie thought carefully before answering. Once she told me not to leave cash sitting on my cart, even if I was only stepping into the supply room. Richard scoffed. That could mean anything. Annie continued without looking at him. I asked why. She said, just keep what a guest gives you close. Then she changed the subject. Karen made another note. That matters. Richard pushed both palms against the edge of the table. This is becoming a collection of rumors. You're taking ordinary comments and building a case around them. William's reply was immediate. No. We have a direct incident I witnessed. A false explanation about a fund. a notebook full of cash entries, and a previous complaint describing the same conduct. The comments are only telling us where to look next. Sarah stood. I'll ask Monica to come up. Not here, Karen said. Use the smaller HR office downstairs. I don't want her walking into a room with Richard sitting across from her. Richard gave a sharp laugh. So I'm not allowed to hear what's being said about me? You'll receive a chance to respond after the interview, Karen said. You will not be present while an employee describes conduct involving you. Sarah left the conference area. Annie watched the door close, then glanced at the clock. Her shift should have had her moving between rooms, checking linen counts and racing checkout deadlines. Instead, she was sitting in a conference office with the owner of the hotel, while corporate HR reopened a complaint that had apparently been buried months ago. William noticed her unease. Do you need to call your mother? Annie looked surprised. I'm still on the clock. Yes. I can wait. You've been here through all of this. Take 5 minutes if you need them. Annie shook her head. I'm okay. Richard muttered. Apparently normal work rules don't apply anymore. William turned toward him. Normal work rules never required employees to surrender cash to you. Richard's mouth tightened. A few minutes later, Sarah sent a message confirming Monica had agreed to speak with Karen privately. Karen muted the conference connection while she conducted the interview through another line. William used the pause to ask Sarah for the scheduling records connected to Monica's complaint. Sarah opened the staffing system. Her hours dropped the week after the complaint. Annie looked up. William stepped closer to the tablet. By how much? She averaged 38 to 40 hours before the complaint. The following 2 weeks, she had 26 and 24. Richard answered before anyone asked him. Occupancy fluctuates. Sarah kept scrolling. Not those weeks. Occupancy was above 80%. Then another department may have adjusted labor. You approved housekeeping schedules. Richard's voice hardened. I approve hundreds of scheduling decisions. I don't remember every individual change. William pointed to the screen. Was Monica warned about performance? Sarah checked. No written warning. Attendance? One late arrival, 2 months before the complaint. Nothing after. Richard shook his head. You can make any set of numbers look suspicious after the fact. William looked at him. You keep calling everything coincidence, misunderstanding, poor wording, incomplete records. At some point, the excuses start forming their own pattern. Karen returned to the call 20 minutes later. Her expression had changed. Monica gave permission for me to summarize her statement in this meeting. Richard folded his arms. Go ahead. Karen glanced at her notes. She says she found $50 in an envelope addressed to housekeeping after a guest checked out. Richard took the envelope and told her larger tips had to be reviewed. She never received the money. Richard interrupted. I don't remember that. Karen continued. 2 weeks later, another guest handed her $30 directly in the hallway. She kept it because the guest placed it in her hand. Richard later asked whether she had received cash from that guest. William's eyes narrowed. How would he know? Karen looked toward Richard. That's one of my questions. Richard shrugged. Guests talk to management. Supervisors report things. Karen continued. Monica says she filed the complaint after a third incident involving another housekeeper. Within days, 2 of her regular shifts disappeared from the schedule. That was staffing. She says you told her. People who question management shouldn't expect special scheduling consideration. Richard's face reddened. That is not an accurate quote. Did you say something similar? I may have told her schedule flexibility depends on cooperation. William's expression hardened. There it is again. Richard turned toward him. Cooperation is part of any workplace. Not when cooperation means surrendering money and staying quiet. Annie had been listening with both hands around the envelope. The more Karen spoke, the less isolated her own experience felt. That should have made her feel better. Instead, it made her wonder how long everyone had adapted to Richard's behavior, because nobody believed challenging him would lead anywhere. Karen looked toward Annie. There's something else. Monica remembers talking to you. Annie's eyebrows lifted. She said she warned you to keep cash close because she was afraid the same thing would happen to you. Annie looked down for a moment. She never told me the whole story. She said she didn't want to put you in the middle of it. Richard seized on that immediately. So Monica admits she was discussing management with other employees. Karen's patience finally thinned. Richard, An employee warning a coworker that management may take her cash is not the defense you think it is. William turned toward Annie. Before today, did you ever think you could report something like this and still keep your hours? Annie answered without hesitation this time. No. Richard looked at her sharply. Annie continued, her voice steadier than before. That's why I asked him for the money back instead of calling anyone. I knew what he could do to my schedule. I knew I needed the overtime more than he needed the $200. William's attention shifted to Richard. That was the part he had been struggling to understand since the hallway. A man with a large salary, benefits, authority, and a private office had seen a tired employee holding $200 meant specifically for her and had still chosen to take it. Then, when she resisted, he had reached for the one weapon she could not ignore, her paycheck. Karen closed the complaint file on her screen. I'm reopening Monica Taylor's case effective immediately, and I'm linking it to today's review. I also want every cash-related complaint from the last year checked against the notebook. Richard's voice rose. You can't turn one allegation into a company-wide hunt. William stepped forward. This stopped being one allegation the moment we found the second name. He looked at the sealed notebook, then at Annie's envelope, and I don't think we're done finding names. Karen kept the reopened complaint on her screen while Sarah began matching the remaining initials in the notebook to current and former housekeeping employees. William stayed near the end of the table, but his attention had shifted away from the list of names. Annie was still holding the envelope with both hands, not like someone protecting money, but like someone trying to understand why $200 had suddenly pulled half the hotel's management structure into the same conversation. Karen noticed it too. Annie, I want to ask you something that has nothing to do with Richard's explanation. Annie looked toward the tablet. Okay, how many overtime hours have you worked over the last 3 weeks? Annie thought for a moment. I'm not sure exactly. Sarah opened the scheduling system. I can pull it. Richard immediately said, her overtime has been approved. There's nothing improper about that. William glanced at him. Nobody said there was. Sarah scrolled through the time records. 31 additional hours over the last 3 weeks. Karen lifted her eyebrows. On top of her regular schedule? Yes. Annie shifted slightly. We've been short-staffed. Sarah nodded. That part is true. Housekeeping has had several open shifts. Karen asked Annie, did you volunteer for all of them? Some. Other times I was asked if I could stay. Did you feel like you could say no? Annie took a second before answering. Sometimes. Richard gave a frustrated laugh. This is a hotel during holiday season. Everybody gets asked to stay late. William turned toward him. You keep answering questions nobody asked you. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. Karen returned to Annie. Why did you keep accepting the hours? Annie looked down at the envelope. At first, she answered with the shortest version. I needed the money. Karen waited. Annie glanced toward William, then Sarah. Nobody interrupted her, so she continued. My mother hasn't been able to work her normal schedule. I've been covering more at home. What does that mean? Karen asked. Rent, groceries, utilities, her medication. Richard shifted beside the table. Her personal expenses have nothing to do with what happened upstairs. William's face hardened. They have everything to do with the threat you made. Richard frowned. I didn't threaten her because of her financial situation. No, William said. You threatened her because you knew she couldn't afford to lose the hours. That's your interpretation. It's hers too. Annie looked at William, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Karen asked, when you found the $200, what did you plan to do with it? Annie rubbed her thumb across the edge of the envelope. Pick up my mother's prescription tonight. And after that, pay the electric bill Friday. Karen nodded. Anything left? Annie gave a tired little smile. Probably groceries. Sarah looked away from the tablet for a moment. Richard did not. He crossed his arms. I'm sorry she has expenses, but every employee in this building has something going on at home. Annie's expression changed. For the first time since the confrontation began, she answered him before William or Karen could. I never asked you to care about my bills. Richard's eyes moved toward her. Annie continued. I asked you to give me back the money those guests left for me. Richard's jaw tightened, and I explained why I took it. No. You gave me a reason that corporate says isn't real. The words came out stronger than Annie expected. She looked almost startled by her own voice, but she did not take them back. William let the moment stand. Richard looked toward him. You're encouraging this. William answered, I'm allowing her to finish a sentence. Annie held the envelope closer to her chest. I've worked almost every day they asked me to. I stayed late. I came in early. I did extra rooms when people called out. I didn't complain because I knew I needed the paycheck. Then somebody left me $200 because they thought I did a good job, and before I even got down the hallway, you took it. Richard said, You keep saying took, as if I put it in my pocket for myself. You did put it in your pocket. His face flushed. That was temporary. Then why did you tell me not to talk about it? Richard pointed toward the envelope. Because employees spreading accusations damages management authority. Annie shook her head. I hadn't accused you of anything yet. That stopped him. William looked at Richard for a long moment. She's right. Richard shifted his attention to Karen. This is turning into an emotional hearing instead of a professional review. Karen removed her glasses and set them beside her keyboard. Richard, professional reviews include motive, pressure, retaliation, and power. Those things don't disappear because they make you uncomfortable. Sarah spoke next. I found something else. Everyone turned toward her. She had opened a payroll comparison for Monica and 2 other employees whose initials appeared in the notebook. 3 housekeeping employees with cash-related entries had reductions in scheduled hours within 2 weeks of the dates listed. Richard's response was immediate. Staffing changes happen constantly. Sarah held up the tablet. Not like this. Their hours dropped while the department was still approving overtime for other employees. Karen asked, Were all 3 employees part of the same shift? No. Same supervisor? 2 different supervisors. William looked at Richard. But one general manager. Richard gave him a hard look. You're reaching, Karen said. Maybe. That's why we verify. She turned to Sarah. Flag those schedules and compare them with employee complaints, performance notes, and attendance records. If there's a legitimate reason for the reductions, we'll see it. Richard paced toward the window and back. You're going to spend days tearing through schedules because Annie got upset over a tip? Annie's face tightened. William stepped closer to Richard. No, we're doing this because you saw someone who needed her paycheck, decided that made her easier to control, and then gave us a notebook suggesting she wasn't the first. Richard looked away. William pointed toward the envelope in Annie's hands. You keep calling it $200 as if the amount makes this small. He turned toward Annie. What was it to you? She answered without thinking this time. Medicine, lights, food. William nodded once and looked back at Richard. That's what you were holding when you threatened her schedule. Karen resumed typing. I'm expanding the review to include scheduling retaliation. Sarah, I need the last 12 months of shift changes tied to every employee whose initials appear in that notebook. Richard's shoulders stiffened. Sarah replied, I'll start now. Annie lowered herself into the chair beside the table. She was still tired, still worried about home, and still uncertain about what the next week would bring. But one thing had changed. The $200 no longer felt like a favor someone might take away if she complained. It felt like proof that her work had been seen. And now, finally, so had the way Richard tried to use that work against her. Sarah spent the next 20 minutes building a timeline on her tablet. She lined up the dates from Richard's notebook against schedule changes, housekeeping rosters, and the complaints Karen had reopened. The pattern was not perfect enough to be dismissed as coincidence, and not yet complete enough to call deliberate retaliation without asking more questions. Karen looked toward Annie. You've done enough for now. You can stay if you want, but you don't have to sit through every interview. Annie shook her head. I want to stay. Richard gave her a sideways glance. Of course you do. William caught it. Say what you mean. Richard turned toward him. I mean, this has stopped being about verifying one tip. She's sitting here while corporate searches for anything it can use against me. Annie answered before anyone else could. I'm sitting here because when I asked for my money back, you told me I might not have a job next week. Richard's mouth tightened. Karen raised a hand. We're not going in circles. Sarah, what do you have? Sarah rotated the tablet toward William. Monica's hours dropped after her complaint. Darlene Washington had a similar reduction in August. Lisa Jackson lost 2 weekend shifts in September. All 3 names appear in the notebook. Any performance problems? Nothing that explains the timing. Richard shook his head. Scheduling is based on occupancy, seniority, availability, call-outs. Dozens of variables. Sarah nodded. That's why I checked the department totals. During those same weeks, other employees picked up overtime. William looked at Richard, who approved the changes. Richard answered through clenched teeth. Housekeeping management. Sarah scrolled farther. Final approval came from your account. That means I clicked approve. It doesn't mean I designed every schedule. Karen leaned closer to her camera. Then the next step is simple. We talked to the supervisors who submitted them. Richard exhaled sharply. You're dismantling the chain of command in the middle of a workday. No, Karen said. We're checking whether someone used it improperly. A message appeared on Sarah's screen. She read it, then looked at William. Darlene is willing to speak. Richard rubbed his temple. Of course she is. William's voice sharpened. You don't get to discredit someone before we hear her. Karen arranged the interview through a private line. 10 minutes later, she returned with several notes and a different expression than before. Darlene says a guest left her $100 in an envelope in August. She brought it to a supervisor because she wasn't sure whether the guest intended it as a tip. Sarah checked the notebook. August 17th, DW, 100. Annie looked at the sealed pouch. Karen continued. The supervisor told Darlene the envelope had her name on it, and she could keep it. Later that day, Richard called her into his office and took the cash for what he described as verification. William asked, did she ever get it back? No. Richard stepped forward. I don't remember that incident. Karen did not react. Darlene says she asked twice over the following week. Did she file a complaint? She says she started one, then stopped after her supervisor warned her that Richard was angry. She kept asking. Richard's voice rose. Now we're relying on things somebody supposedly said months ago? Karen replied. We're relying on the fact that her name, date, and amount match a record in your notebook. That proves I documented it. It also proves you remember it well enough to write it down. Richard fell quiet. Sarah checked another screen. There's no lost property report for that room, William asked. Any guest inquiry about missing cash? None. Any receipt showing it went somewhere else? None, Karen said, and Darlene's Saturday shifts were reduced beginning 9 days later. Richard slapped one palm against the table. Enough. You're building a story first and looking for facts second. Annie flinched at the sound, but William did not move. Then give us the facts, he said. Where did Darlene's $100 go? Richard's face reddened. I don't know. Where did Monica's 50 go? I don't know. Where was Annie's 200 going before I stopped you? Richard pointed toward the envelope. It was still in my hand. No. It was in your jacket and you were leaving. I was going downstairs. You told her to keep quiet before you walked away. Richard looked toward Annie. I told her not to spread accusations. Annie's voice came out steady. I hadn't accused you of anything. I asked you to return an envelope with my name on it. Richard turned toward her. You keep repeating that as if handwriting settles everything. William moved between them again. It settles guest intent better than your imaginary fun did. Karen took off her glasses. Richard, I need you to understand where this stands. We now have 3 employees describing similar cash incidents. Notebook entries matching those incidents. No accounting trail. No approved tip fund. And schedule reductions following at least 2 complaints. You need to provide a complete explanation. Richard looked around the table, then toward the office door. For the first time, he seemed to understand that there was no private conversation left to control. Finally, he said, fine. Sometimes cash was held because I didn't trust the way some employees handled guest property. Annie's eyes narrowed. Karen asked, which employees? Richard hesitated. William noticed. Say it. Richard looked at Annie, then away. Certain housekeeping staff. That isn't an answer. I used judgment. Sarah's voice grew colder. What criteria? Richard pressed his lips together. Karen glanced at the names on her screen. Monica Taylor. Darlene Washington. Lisa Jackson. Annie Carter. Then she asked a question that changed the room. Did you apply this so-called judgment to every employee who received cash tips? Richard did not answer. Sarah pulled another set of records. I can check. Richard turned quickly. That isn't necessary. William looked at him. It is now. Sarah searched recent guest commendations and gratuity notes. After a minute, she found several entries involving housekeepers whose initials never appeared in Richard's notebook. One employee received $150 last month, Sarah said. No management hold. Another received $250 in September. No review. Karen asked, "Who were they?" Sarah read the names. Annie recognized both women. Richard said nothing. William's expression changed as the implication became clear. The rule wasn't based on the amount, he said. Richard looked away. Karen followed the data farther, and it wasn't applied evenly. The investigation had just moved beyond missing tips. Now they had to determine why Richard had decided some employees needed to surrender money while others did not. Sarah kept the employee records open while Karen asked her to separate every documented cash tip incident by amount, date, employee, and outcome. Within minutes, the difference was difficult to explain away. Several housekeepers had received gratuities larger than $100 without any intervention from management. Their tips were never recorded in Richard's notebook, never held for verification, and never followed by schedule cuts. Karen studied the names on her screen. "Richard, I'm going to ask this once, and I want a direct answer. Why did you decide some employees could keep cash, while others had to hand it over?" Richard's posture tightened. "Because circumstances were different." "What circumstances?" "Work history, reliability, judgment, whether I thought there was a risk of confusion with guest property." Sarah looked at the records again. "Annie has no disciplinary history." Richard said nothing. "Monica had one attendance note in 12 months, Sarah continued. "Darlene has strong performance reviews. Lisa has been here more than 5 years. What exactly made them higher risk?" Richard turned toward William. "This is what happens when people who don't run the floor start reducing management decisions to spreadsheets," William answered without raising his voice. "Then help us understand the decisions without hiding behind management language." Richard's eyes shifted toward Annie before returning to William. "Some employees require closer supervision." Annie's fingers tightened around the envelope. "Why?" Richard ignored her. She asked again, "Why did I require closer supervision?" "You're new. I'm not the newest housekeeper. You're young. So are 2 people Sarah just said kept bigger tips." Richard's face hardened. "This isn't a debate." William took one step closer. "It became one the moment you started deciding who deserved different rules." Karen looked at Sarah. "Read the names again." "The employees whose cash Richard documented." Sarah did. Monica Taylor, Darlene Washington, Lisa Jackson, Annie Carter. Several more followed. Karen then asked for the employees who had received comparable tips without management interference. Sarah read those names too. No one needed to announce the difference before Annie noticed it. Neither did William. Karen chose her words carefully. "Richard, most of the employees in your notebook are black women working in housekeeping. The employees Sarah found receiving comparable tips without intervention are mostly white. Do you have an explanation for that pattern?" Richard's expression sharpened immediately. "Don't turn this into race. I asked you for an explanation. There is no racial policy here. No one said there was a written racial policy. This is offensive." Annie looked at him. "What part is offensive?" Richard turned toward her. "You need to be very careful about what you're suggesting." William stepped in before the warning could grow. "No, she does not need to be careful because you're uncomfortable." Richard looked at him. "You know me. You know I would never discriminate against anyone." William's reply came after a brief pause. "I know what I saw today. I know the rule you cited doesn't exist. I know you recorded cash taken from employees without an accounting trail. I know several of those employees lost hours after questioning you. Now I know you didn't apply the same treatment to everyone. That still doesn't prove racism." Karen nodded slightly. "You're right about one thing. A pattern requires investigation before we make a formal finding. That investigation starts now." Richard spread his hands. "So my reputation gets destroyed while everyone digs through decisions made over years?" William looked toward the framed plaque mounted beside the conference room entrance. It carried the company's 3 stated values in brushed metal letters: respect, service, integrity. He had passed versions of the same plaque in dozens of Whitmore properties without thinking much about them. This time he read the words differently. "Your reputation isn't the first concern in this room," he said. "The employees who had money taken from them are." Richard gave a bitter laugh. You're willing to throw away years of strong performance over this? William turned back to him. You keep using performance as though revenue can cancel conduct. I kept this hotel profitable through staffing shortages, rising costs, guest complaints, and impossible labor targets. You know what this property was before I took over. And you think that gives you permission to treat people however you want? I think results matter. They do. Richard waited, expecting more. William continued. But results don't excuse intimidation. A full hotel doesn't make a false policy true. A high guest score doesn't justify taking money from someone who earned it. Richard's hands dropped to his sides. You're making me sound like a thief. William held up the white envelope. I watched you remove $200 from Annie's hand, put it in your jacket, and threaten her schedule when she objected. You can argue over labels later. I'm interested in actions. Annie looked at the writing on the envelope again. Thank you for your dedication. A few hours earlier, those words had made her feel noticed. Richard had almost managed to turn them into something she was ashamed to hold. Karen broke the pause. I want an immediate hold placed on any scheduling changes involving employees connected to this review. Sarah, preserve all shift histories, complaint records, and manager notes. Nobody edits anything. Sarah nodded. I'll have it lock the records. Richard looked toward William. You're freezing my authority based on allegations? I'm preventing you from affecting the people we need to interview. You don't trust me. William's answer was simple. Not with this investigation. For the first time, Richard seemed to understand how much ground he had lost. He was still standing in a hotel he managed, wearing the same expensive suit and carrying the same title. But the authority behind it had begun to disappear. He tried another direction. William, think about the damage this can do if staff starts believing every management decision can be challenged. Annie looked up. William noticed. That, he said, is exactly the problem. Richard frowned. You think respect means nobody questions you. It doesn't. It means the person carrying towels down a service hallway gets the same right to tell the truth as the person sitting in the general manager's office. Richard's jaw tightened. That sounds good in a speech. It isn't a speech. It's how this company is supposed to operate. Karen added. And retaliation against an employee for reporting misconduct is a serious violation, regardless of title. Richard looked around as though searching for someone still willing to treat this as a minor dispute. No one did. Then he said, so what happens now? William glanced at Annie, then at Sarah's tablet filled with names and cash amounts. Now we find out how many people were afraid to ask the same question Annie asked today. Richard's face changed. William continued. And after that, we decide whether you still have any business managing them. Karen ended the video call long enough to bring in a second corporate HR representative and confirm the termination procedure. Sarah remained at the table, reviewing the preserved records while Richard stood near the window, no longer offering explanations unless someone addressed him directly. The expensive suit that had helped him dominate the hallway earlier now seemed like nothing more than clothing worn by a man whose authority was being measured against evidence. When Karen returned to the screen, she had another document open. Richard, I need you to listen carefully. Based on what we have confirmed today, William has authorized immediate termination of your employment with Whitmore Hotels. I'm going to explain the process before anything else happens. Richard turned sharply toward William. You've already made the decision? Yes. Before a full review is finished? William met his eyes. The broader review continues. Your employment does not. Richard stepped away from the window. You can't seriously be firing me over one envelope and a handful of complaints that were never proven. William picked up the white envelope from the table and held it between two fingers. This is not why you're being fired. Richard gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Then what exactly is? You created a policy that corporate says does not exist. You took cash from an employee after she told you it was intended for her. You threatened her schedule when she questioned you. We found records of similar cash incidents with no accounting trail. We found a complaint against you that you helped close without a real review. We found scheduling changes following complaints. That is enough for me to decide you should not supervise another employee here. Richard looked toward Karen. And corporate is supporting this? Karen answered, yes. He paced once across the end of the conference area, then stopped. After everything I've done for this hotel? William did not answer immediately. Richard continued, faster now. Occupancy is up, revenue is up. We beat labor targets 3 quarters in a row. I kept this property running when half the department heads said staffing was impossible. You congratulated me for the numbers 6 months ago. I did. So that means nothing? It means you performed part of your job well. Richard's face tightened. William continued. It does not purchase permission to mistreat the people working under you. Richard pointed toward Annie. You're ending my career because she got emotional over a tip. Annie's head lifted. William stepped forward before Richard could say anything else. Do not reduce what happened to her reaction. I'm stating a fact. No, you're doing what you've done all afternoon. You keep describing everybody else's response instead of your own conduct. Richard looked at Annie. You understand what's happening here, don't you? People lose careers over accusations like this. Annie's fingers tightened around the envelope, but she answered him. I didn't make you take it. Richard's mouth closed. I didn't make you say there was a fund, she continued. I didn't make you tell me my hours could disappear. You decided all of that before anyone came upstairs. Sarah looked down at her tablet, giving Annie the space to finish. Richard turned away from her. Fine. I handled it badly. I admit that. But firing me immediately is excessive. Karen said, this is not a negotiation. Richard ignored her and focused on William. Suspend me. Put me on leave. Cut my bonus. I'll cooperate with the review. William shook his head. William, come on. I have a family. I have a mortgage. I have people depending on me. That sentence changed the expression on Annie's face. William noticed. So did Annie. Richard paused. William continued. She told you she needed the job. She told you her mother depended on her income. What did you do with that information? Richard said nothing. You used it. That's not fair. William's voice hardened. When she told you she needed her hours, how much mercy did you give her? Richard looked down. No answer came. Karen broke in. Richard, your badge, company phone, keys, and any hotel-issued devices need to be turned over to Sarah now. Richard remained where he was. Sarah stood and placed a small document tray on the table. For several seconds, he did not move. Then he reached into his jacket and removed his phone. He set it down harder than necessary. Next came the key ring, followed by the access card clipped inside his coat. Sarah checked each item against the list. Richard kept his eyes on William. You're going to regret doing this so quickly. William replied. If the review shows more problems, I'll regret not seeing them sooner. Richard gave him a bitter look. You think firing one manager fixes your company? No. That answer caught him off guard. William continued. It fixes one decision I can make today. The rest starts after you leave. Karen explained that his system access would be disabled immediately and that any further communication about the investigation would go through corporate HR. Richard barely listened. He looked toward Annie once more. You've made sure everyone here knows my name now. Annie shook her head. They already knew your name. That was part of the problem. Richard's expression sharpened, but William stepped slightly between them. That's enough. Sarah opened the conference door. 2 members of hotel security waited outside. Not to create a spectacle, but to escort Richard through the administrative exit and make sure no files or company property left with him. When Richard saw them, whatever remained of his confidence cracked. Security? Seriously? Sarah answered. Standard procedure when management access is terminated immediately. He looked toward William one last time. Years of work, and this is how it ends? William replied. Your years here are not erased. Neither are your decisions today. Richard picked up his personal briefcase. As he walked toward the door, he stopped beside Annie. She tensed. William moved before Richard could speak, placing himself between them. Richard looked at him, then continued into the hallway. The security officers followed. A few moments later, the elevator doors closed behind him. Annie remained seated, as if her body had not yet caught up with what had happened. Sarah collected the last documents from the table while Karen stayed connected on the screen. William turned toward Annie. You're still employed here. Your schedule stays protected. Nobody involved in this review can retaliate against you. Annie looked at the envelope in her hands. Is he really gone? Yes. She nodded once, but her eyes remained on the handwriting across the front. William pulled out the chair across from her and sat. I know this doesn't erase the way he spoke to you. Annie answered quietly. I kept thinking I was the one who was going to get fired. William looked toward the closed conference door. That should never have been your first fear. Karen spoke from the tablet. Annie, before you leave today, we're also reviewing every overtime hour you worked. If anything is missing or incorrectly recorded, payroll will correct it. Annie looked surprised. I wasn't asking for that. I know, Karen said. That's why we're checking. William reached across the table and pushed the envelope closer to Annie. This part doesn't require another review. She looked at him. He tapped the handwritten name with one finger. That gest made the intention clear. For the first time all afternoon, Annie held the $200 without someone standing over her. But William knew returning one envelope was only the beginning. Richard had left the building. The questions he created were still inside it. Karen stayed on the video call, while Sarah opened Annie's time records on the conference room screen. The hallway outside had returned to its normal rhythm, but inside the office the work continued. Richard's departure had ended the confrontation, not the questions raised by it. Sarah pulled up 3 weeks of time cards. Annie, I need you to check these with me. Don't guess. If something looks wrong, say so. Annie moved her chair closer to the screen. Okay. The first week showed 6 shifts, including 2 late extensions. The second showed another 6 days and several hours added after the scheduled end of her shift. The current week was not yet complete. Karen asked, were you clocked in every time you stayed late? As far as I know. Did anyone ever ask you to clock out and keep working? No. Sarah checked the totals. Her overtime rate looks correct so far. Annie seemed relieved. So nothing's missing? I'm not finished, Sarah said. There are 2 manual adjustments. She opened the first entry. Last Thursday. Your shift ends at 6:22, then somebody changed it to 5:45. Annie frowned. I was still cleaning rooms after 6. Do you remember roughly when you left? A little after 6:30. I caught the train around 7. Karen asked, who approved the edit? Sarah clicked the audit trail. Her expression tightened. Richard. William, who had been standing near the conference room door, turned back toward the table. Reason? None entered. Sarah opened the second adjustment. Same thing Monday, 28 minutes removed. Annie looked from the screen to Sarah. I didn't know managers could change that. They can correct obvious errors, Karen said, but changes need a legitimate reason. We'll compare these with access logs in your department records. Annie shook her head. I wasn't watching the clock every minute. I was just trying to finish. That's exactly why payroll records are supposed to be accurate without you having to police them, Karen replied. William pulled out a chair and sat across from Annie. How many times have you checked your time card before payday? Annie gave him an embarrassed look. Usually I check the deposit. Not the hours? I know about what the check should be, Sarah said. A lot of employees do the same thing. That's why small adjustments can go unnoticed. William's expression tightened at the phrase, small adjustments. To a corporate report, half an hour could disappear inside a line of payroll data. To Annie, repeated often enough, it meant bus fare, groceries, or part of a prescription. Karen continued, we're reviewing every manual change Richard approved for your time card. We'll do the same for the employees connected to the gratuity review. Annie rested the envelope on the table. I don't want people thinking I started all this just because of money. William answered, you didn't start it. You asked for something a guest gave you, and Richard decided your paycheck was a useful way to shut you down. Annie looked at the handwriting across the envelope. I still have to come back tomorrow, right? Sarah's eyes lifted from the tablet. Yes. You're scheduled at 8. The question seemed to surprise William more than Annie's answer. You're worried the schedule could still change? She gave a small shrug. Things change fast around here. Not this time, Karen said. Your current schedule is protected while the review is active. Any change involving you has to go through Sarah and corporate HR. Annie nodded, but the tension did not disappear entirely. Sarah noticed. You've worked 6 straight days. You're also scheduled tomorrow and Friday. Karen checked the dates. That needs another look. Annie reacted immediately. Please don't take my hours away. No one said that, Sarah replied. I need the overtime. William leaned forward slightly. There's a difference between earning overtime and working yourself into the ground because you're afraid to lose the chance. I'm Fina. Sarah gave her a look that made Annie stop. You almost tripped over a mop because Richard grabbed something out of your hand. I've also seen you rubbing your wrists all week. You're tired. Annie glanced toward the door. Everybody's tired. That doesn't make it healthy. Karen suggested shifting one of Annie's upcoming days to paid administrative leave while payroll completed the review. Annie immediately shook her head. I don't want special treatment, William answered. Being paid for a day while the company sorts out a management investigation is not special treatment. It feels like it. Then call it what it is. The hotel disrupted your workday. The hotel can absorb the cost. Annie considered that. One day? One day, Karen said. Paid at your normal scheduled hours. Your overtime already worked stays on the books. Annie finally nodded. Okay. Sarah updated the schedule. Karen then asked whether Annie had access to the company's employee assistance program. Annie had heard the name during orientation, but had never used it. It includes emergency support, Karen explained. Short-term help with medical costs, utilities, transportation, things like that. Applications are confidential. Annie looked uncomfortable. I'm not asking the company to pay my bills. No one is asking you to hand over your dignity to accept help, William said. The program exists because employees sometimes hit a hard month. She looked at him. Would using it affect my job? No. My hours? No. Would Richard have been able to see it? Karen answered. Not the details. That seemed to matter. Sarah sent Annie the application link and offered to help if she wanted it later. Annie thanked her but did not open it yet. William looked at the envelope again. Have you decided what you're doing with the 200? Annie gave him the first genuine smile he had seen from her all afternoon. I already knew before Richard took it. Your mother's prescription? First stop. And after that? The electric bill. Sarah smiled. Very glamorous. Annie laughed softly. You should see my grocery list. The brief humor eased something in the office that had been tight for hours. Karen closed the payroll screen. We'll continue reviewing the time cards. If we find anything owed, it will be corrected through payroll, not handed to you quietly, in an office. Annie nodded. William stood and pushed his chair back into place. Before leaving, Annie picked up the envelope and slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of her uniform. This time no one reached for it. She paused at the door and turned toward William. Thank you. He shook his head. Don't thank me for giving back what should never have been taken. Annie considered that, then nodded and walked into the corridor. Sarah watched her leave. William remained beside the table, looking at the payroll screen Sarah had not yet closed. 2 altered time entries sat highlighted in yellow. He had come to Atlanta expecting to inspect a hotel. Instead, he was beginning to understand how easily a business could look successful from the lobby, while the people behind its service doors carried costs nobody upstairs had bothered to count. The payroll review continued after Annie left the conference area. By late afternoon, Sarah and Karen had confirmed that Richard had manually reduced several of Annie's recorded work periods without attaching explanations required by company procedure. The missing time was not enormous on any single day, but together it represented hours Annie had already worked and expected to see in her paycheck. Karen enlarged the adjustment history on the screen. There are 5 edits in the last month. 3 are supported by supervisor notes. 2 aren't. William looked at the total. Correct the unsupported ones. We will. Payroll can include them in the next deposit. No special check? Karen shook her head. Better to process it normally with the proper overtime calculation and a written correction notice. That's what I want. Sarah closed one file and opened another. We should also review the same type of edits for Monica, Darlene, and Lisa. William nodded. Do it. If we're correcting something, we correct the process, not only the person standing closest to us today. By then, Annie was downstairs collecting her coat. Sarah caught up with her near the employee entrance. Before you go, one more thing. Annie stopped. Did something else happen? Nothing bad. We found 2 time card edits that should not have been made without documentation. Annie's eyebrows lifted. How much? Not enough to change your life, but enough that it needs to be fixed. Payroll will add the missing time and overtime rate. Annie looked down at her phone as if already rearranging the week's numbers in her head. So, it'll be on my next check? Yes. Okay, thank you. Sarah gave her a small smile. That part is wages you already earned. You don't need to thank anybody for correcting them. Annie slipped the phone into her pocket. The sentence sounded familiar after everything William had said about the envelope. But hearing it applied to her time changed something. Money could be taken in more than one way. Sometimes it vanished from a hand. Sometimes it disappeared inside a time card nobody expected an employee to inspect. Sarah walked with her toward the exit. Karen also approved your paid administrative day tomorrow. Annie immediately looked concerned. That won't cancel my overtime from this week? No. And I'm still scheduled after that? Yes. I just don't want people thinking I got a free day because I complained. You spent most of your shift in an HR investigation caused by management conduct. This is the company giving you time to recover and complete any paperwork without losing income. Annie considered it, then nodded. All right. Outside, traffic moved along the Atlanta streets as the late afternoon rush began building. Annie was about to head toward Marta when Sarah handed her a printed card. This is the Employee Assistance Program number. You don't have to use it, but Karen asked me to explain it properly. Annie looked at the card. Is this the one for emergency bills? Among other things. Medication, utilities, short-term transportation needs, counseling, financial guidance. There's also a small hardship grant program. Annie's expression tightened with embarrassment. I don't want charity. Sarah did not argue. Then don't think of it that way. The hotel funds the program because employees pay a price when life gets expensive. You decide whether it helps. Annie ran one finger along the edge of the card. Does everybody have access? Eligible employees do. Then maybe I'll call. That's all I'm asking. Annie tucked it beside the envelope inside her bag and headed toward the station. Upstairs, William was still reviewing the employee benefit information Karen had sent. The emergency assistance program had existed for years, yet participation at the Atlanta property was lower than at comparable hotels. Why aren't people using this? He asked. Sarah had returned by then. Some don't know about it. Some think asking for help goes through local management. Does it? Applications go through the third-party administrator, but Richard was supposed to make employees aware of the benefit. William looked at the participation numbers again. Did he? Sarah hesitated. I can't remember him ever discussing it in a staff meeting. William closed the file. Then starting next week, every employee gets the information directly. Not buried in an orientation packet. Karen, still connected by video, added, we can include it in payroll communications and post it in the employee areas. Do that. Sarah then remembered something. There's another benefit Annie may not know about. What? Education assistance. William looked up. She mentioned once that she was thinking about community college, Sarah said. Not today. A few weeks ago, when someone asked about schedule availability, Karen checked the policy. She qualifies after her current service period. Tuition support starts with approved certificate programs and community college courses. William nodded. Make sure she gets the information. Don't make it sound like a reward for today. I won't. He pointed toward the screen. That matters. I don't want her thinking she has to earn basic support by going through something like this. The next morning, Annie called the assistance number from her kitchen table. The application was shorter than she expected. She submitted information about her mother's medication and the overdue utility balance, then set the phone down before she could talk herself out of finishing it. An hour later, Sarah called. Did I catch you at a bad time? No, I'm home. Good. I wanted to let you know payroll confirmed the correction. Also, I'm sending you information about the education program. Annie paused. Education? Community college, certificate programs, tuition assistance, no pressure. I just realized nobody had explained it to you. Annie looked toward the small stack of bills beside her. I've thought about school. Then read it when you have time. I don't know if I could manage work and classes. You don't have to decide today. Annie smiled faintly. For once, nobody's asking me to decide something today. Sarah laughed. Then enjoy that. Before ending the call, Annie asked, Sarah? Yes? Why is everybody doing all this now? Sarah took a moment before answering. Because sometimes a company gets so used to measuring rooms, revenue, and labor hours that it forgets to ask whether the people doing the work can actually use the systems meant to support them. Annie looked at the envelope still resting on the table. And now? Now we fix what we can. After the call ended, Annie opened the tuition assistance email. For the first time in weeks, she was looking at a number that did not represent something she owed. By the following Monday, Whitmore Grand felt different in ways guests would never notice. The chandeliers still lit the lobby before sunrise, the breakfast room still filled with the smell of coffee and toasted bread, and housekeeping carts still rolled through the service corridors on schedule. The changes were happening behind staff doors, where Sarah Mitchell had spent the weekend rebuilding procedures that had once depended too heavily on one manager's word. At 7:30, Sarah gathered the housekeeping team in the employee dining area. Coffee, oatmeal, scrambled eggs, biscuits, and fruit had been set out for employees coming off early shifts or preparing to begin the day. Instead of standing behind a podium, Sarah took a place beside the bulletin board, where Richard's management notices had been removed. Annie entered with Monica and Darlene, carrying a paper cup of coffee. She had expected another formal meeting. Instead, employees were talking quietly over breakfast while Karen Brooks appeared on a large monitor from corporate HR. Sarah waited until everyone had settled. "I know the last several days have created a lot of questions," she began. "I'm not going to pretend one meeting answers all of them. What I can do is explain what changes today." Several employees exchanged glances. Sarah held up a one-page policy sheet. First, cash gratuities clearly designated for a specific employee stay with that employee. If a guest writes your name on an envelope, hands you cash directly, or clearly indicates the tip is for you, management cannot take it away and hold it in an unofficial fund. Monica gave a humorless little laugh. "Would have been nice to hear that 6 months ago." Sarah nodded. "Yes, it would have." There was no excuse attached to the answer. Karen continued from the screen. "Second, if there is a legitimate question about guest intent, the employee will be present during verification whenever possible. Any temporary handling of cash must be documented, and the employee receives a written record." Darlene raised her hand. "What happens if a manager says we're being disrespectful just for asking questions? Then you report that too." Karen replied. "Questions about wages, tips, schedules, or policy are not misconduct." Another housekeeper asked, "Report it to who? Because going through management didn't work before." Sarah turned to a second sheet taped beside the bulletin board. A phone number and website were printed in large type. "This goes directly to an outside reporting service. Complaints involving local management will not be routed back to the person named in the complaint." Monica looked at Annie. "That part I like." Sarah continued, "Retaliation is also being reviewed separately. That includes cutting hours, changing shifts, issuing unsupported discipline, or creating worse assignments because someone reported a concern." An older employee near the coffee machine raised her hand. "What if they don't say that's why they did it?" Karen answered, "That's why schedule history and documentation matter. Managers will have to support changes with legitimate operational reasons." The woman nodded slowly. "Good. Because people know how to punish you without saying the word punish." William Whitmore had been standing near the rear entrance for several minutes, listening without interrupting. He had returned to Atlanta that morning after spending the weekend in calls with corporate leadership. No announcement had been made about his presence, but employees gradually noticed him. Annie saw him last. He gave her a small nod and remained where he was. Sarah moved to the next subject. "Corporate is also reviewing all prior cash complaints connected to Richard. Anyone who previously reported missing gratuities will be contacted individually. If company records and employee statements establish that money should have been paid to you, finance will arrange reimbursement." A murmur moved through the group. One employee asked, "How far back?" "As far as the available records allow us to verify fairly." William finally spoke from the rear. "And if our records are poor because management failed to keep them properly, that failure will not automatically be held against the employee." Heads turned toward him. William stepped forward but stopped several feet from the group. "I want to say something before this meeting ends." No one moved. For years, this company has measured guest satisfaction, occupancy, labor costs, revenue, and hundreds of other numbers. Those things matter. But there is another measurement we did not examine closely enough. He looked across the employees in front of him, whether the people doing the work felt safe enough to speak when management crossed a line. Monica folded her arms. "Some of us spoke." William nodded. "You did. And the system failed to respond correctly." He did not soften the admission. "That is on leadership." Annie listened from beside Darlene. She had seen executives visit the property before, though usually those visits meant pressed uniforms, rehearsed greetings, and supervisors rushing through corridors to make sure everything looked perfect. This did not feel like that, William continued. Richard made his own decisions, and he is responsible for them. But if one manager can close a complaint against himself, and nobody above him notices, then replacing him is not enough. Sarah handed out the remaining information sheets. They covered employee assistance, education benefits, payroll review procedures, and the new reporting system. Annie looked at the education section again. Darlene leaned toward her. You thinking about using that? Maybe. For school? Annie nodded. Community college. Darlene smiled. Good. I haven't decided. You don't have to decide this morning. Monica joined them. Just don't work 80 hours trying to pay tuition if the company is offering help. Annie laughed. I wasn't planning 80. You would if they let you. That's probably true. The ease of the exchange surprised Annie. A week earlier, conversations about money stopped whenever a supervisor entered the break room. Now employees were asking questions while the company owner stood within hearing distance. After the meeting, most employees returned to their floors. Annie stayed behind long enough to refill her coffee. An older housekeeper named Gloria passed her near the counter and touched her lightly on the arm. You did something important. Annie shook her head. I just asked for my tip. That was enough. Annie looked toward William, who was speaking with Sarah. Gloria followed her eyes. Remember something, she said. Needing a paycheck doesn't mean you owe anybody your silence. Annie held the paper cup between both hands. I wish I'd understood that sooner. Gloria smiled. Most people understand it after they've had to learn it the hard way. Across the room, William watched employees leave with the new policy sheets folded under their arms. He knew no memo could erase what had already happened, and no hotline could guarantee perfect judgment from every manager. But the structure had changed. No general manager at Whitmore Grand would again be allowed to invent a cash rule, silence an employee, then review the complaint against himself. Annie headed toward the service elevator with her card assignment for the day. Before the doors opened, she slipped the education assistance sheet into the front pocket of her bag instead of throwing it away. Several weeks earlier, every extra hour had been about surviving the next bill. Now, for the first time, one of those sheets of paper pointed toward something beyond the next paycheck. 3 weeks later, the Whitmore Grand had moved fully into the Christmas season. Garland wrapped the staircase rails in the lobby, brass ornaments hung above the front desk, and a pianist played quiet holiday standards near the lounge, while travelers crossed the marble floor with suitcases, shopping bags, and winter coats folded over their arms. The changes behind the service doors had settled into routine as well. Sarah now ran the Atlanta property while corporate continued reviewing Richard's old records. The reporting hotline number remained posted in every employee area, and housekeeping staff had begun asking questions that once would have been whispered only during breaks. Annie noticed the difference most in small moments. Nobody questioned her when she checked her time card. Nobody made a comment when she asked why a shift had changed. When a guest handed a housekeeper cash in the hallway, the supervisor simply reminded the employee to record the gratuity if required for tax reporting and continued walking. The world had not transformed. Work was still work, rooms still had to be cleaned, sheets still had to be changed, and holiday occupancy meant long days. But fear was no longer part of every decision. That afternoon, Annie was assigned a suite on the 11th floor after a family checked out early to catch a flight. She pushed her cart inside, opened the curtains, and began stripping the bed. The television was still on, playing a local weather report. A coffee cup sat beside the window, and 2 unopened sugar packets had been left near the machine. Annie worked through the room in the order she always used. Towels first. Linens. Bathroom. Surfaces. Vacuum. Final check. She had just finished straightening the pillows when she noticed a white envelope on the nightstand. She stopped. For a second, she did not touch it. Her name was written across the front. For Annie. Thank you. There was no long message this time, only those 4 words. Annie picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were several bills folded together. Her first reaction came before thought. She turned toward the open door. The hallway was empty except for another housekeeping cart parked several rooms away. No polished shoes approached. No voice called her name. No hand reached toward the envelope. Annie stood there for another moment, then laughed quietly at herself. She folded the envelope closed and slipped it into the inside pocket of her apron. The act felt almost ordinary. That was what surprised her most. A few minutes later, Monica passed the doorway carrying fresh towels. "You good?" Annie smiled. "Yeah." Monica noticed the expression. "Somebody leave you something?" "Maybe." Monica grinned. "Then keep moving before I ask for half." Annie laughed. "You're not getting anything. See? You're learning." They went back to work. By late afternoon, Annie finished her rooms and headed downstairs to clock out. Her schedule had changed since the investigation, not because anyone had cut her hours, but because Sarah had stopped allowing the department to solve every staffing shortage with the same few employees. Annie still accepted overtime when she wanted it, but she no longer felt as if saying no once would close the door forever. Her mother's medication was current. The emergency assistance program had covered part of an overdue utility balance, and Annie had used the original $200 on the things she had planned from the beginning: medicine, electricity, and groceries. The education application had taken longer. She had opened it twice, closed it twice, then finally submitted it on a Sunday evening. Now a printed email sat folded inside her bag. She had been approved for tuition assistance toward courses at a local community college beginning in January. Nothing about it promised an easy future. She would still have to work. She would still have to study after long shifts. She would still have bills waiting at home. But for the first time, she was making plans that reached farther than Friday. When Annie entered the lobby, William was standing near the front desk speaking with Sarah. He had returned for a short corporate meeting and was due to leave for the airport within the hour. Sarah spotted Annie first. "Heading home?" "Yes." "How was Eleven?" "Busy, but fine." William turned. "You're still planning to start classes?" Annie smiled. "January. What are you taking?" "General education first. I'm still figuring out the rest." "That sounds like a plan." "It sounds like the beginning of one." William nodded. "Those count too." Annie adjusted the strap of her bag. "I got approved for the tuition program." "I heard." She raised an eyebrow. "Sarah told you?" Sarah immediately lifted both hands. "Only that you were approved. Nothing private." Annie laughed. "I'm not mad." William looked at her for a moment. "Good. Then congratulations." "Thank you." This time she meant it without hesitation. A bellman passed with a luggage cart, and the pianist shifted into a slower Christmas song. Near the front entrance, an older couple stopped beneath the decorations to take a photograph before heading outside. Annie glanced toward the employee corridor. "I should catch my train." Sarah nodded. "See you Thursday." "Thursday," William said. "Take care, Annie." "You too." She started across the lobby, then stopped and turned back. "William?" "Yes?" "I used to think asking questions was how you lost hours." He waited. "Now people ask Sarah things all day." Sarah sighed. "Constantly." Annie smiled. William did too. "That's probably healthier." "It's louder." "I can live with louder." Annie continued toward the service exit. William watched her go, then turned toward Sarah. "How many complaints have come through the new hotline?" 7. His expression shifted. "That many?" "Most are small. Scheduling questions, payroll corrections, supervisor issues." "Good." Sarah looked surprised. "Good?" "It means people believe someone might answer." A few minutes later, Annie stepped outside into the cold Atlanta evening. She reached into her apron pocket before changing out of her uniform and touched the new envelope. 3 weeks earlier, another envelope had been ripped from her hand and used to remind her how little power she had. This one stayed where she put it. The $200 had never been the biggest thing Richard tried to take from Annie. He had tried to convince her that hard work could be taken without explanation, that fear was simply part of earning a paycheck, and that people with less authority should learn to stay quiet. He failed. The money came back. Her hours were corrected. The threat disappeared. But the real change was harder to count. Annie could speak without first calculating what honesty might cost her. And sometimes justice does not begin in a courtroom or under television lights. Sometimes it begins in a hotel hallway, when someone with the power to look away decides not to. This story reminds us that dignity should never depend on a person's job title, income, age, or race. Hard work deserves respect, and no one should be forced to stay silent simply because they are afraid of losing a paycheck. Real leadership is not measured only by profits or success, but by how people with the least power are treated when no one important seems to be watching. Annie's experience also shows that speaking the truth can be frightening, Yet one honest voice can expose injustice and protect others from suffering the same treatment. In the end, justice begins when someone chooses to listen, act fairly, and refuse to let power become an excuse for cruelty. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.